2017, MIT grad student, programmer, and poet of code Joy Buolamwini delivered a TED conference to expose an ongoing discourse on AI and machine learning. Applying personal stories and scientific research data should critique the deficiency of a series of facial recognition software that is incapable of detecting the features of black and other minorities, thus coining the term the coded gaze that is reminiscent of the white gaze, the male gaze, and the post-colonial gaze to describe technological and algorithmic bias in this post-digital and neoliberal era. In 2019, Buolamwini further elaborated this concept through World Economic Forum with the aid of intersectional analyses, which studied the accuracy of facial recognition from major tech companies across race and gender. Her discovery in the accurate detection rate revealed a pernicious disparity of facial recognition algorithms that has significantly favored pale males over darker-skinned females. This disparity, as Buolamwini argues, subsequently leads to discriminatory practices with unjust social consequences, conducing the police in the US and the UK to enforce unregulated practices of facial recognition in public places that result in high false match rates. This police surveillance is further exaggerated by companies such as IBM, which, for example, developed the technology for the NYPD in 2019 to aid racial profiling via an implemented search filter based on skin color. This discovery of algorithmic bias resonates deeply with Sofia Umoja-Noble's presentation in a TEDx conference in 2014, which was a speech intended with her concurrent publication, Algorithms of Oppression, that unveils the problems of systemic algorithmic bias toward black people, retracing past incidents of algorithmic racism and sexism throughout the 2010s that reinforce stereotypes and racial discrimination. In the introduction of her book, Noble also records incidents of algorithmic bias from Google search engines that inaccurately portrayed and fetishized black people, triggering an effect of discrimination. As a matter of fact, algorithms can never be racist nor sexist. Instead, these biases are engendered from the practices and the preferences of individuals or corporations who possess power in the real world. These practices are usually enclosed in black box operations controlled by the puppet masters from the major tech companies who mark them as clandestine to the general public. In that regard, in order to understand algorithmic bias, one first needs to comprehend real-life power relations in light of surveillance, control, and privacy. That is, what are the types of power relations and in what way do they function? To answer these questions, we should first look back to the great philosopher in the 20th century. In the practice of everyday life, Michel de Certeau divides a society into two large categories. Those who are powerful apply strategies to preserve space, and those who are weak apply tactics to subvert control through clever tricks. Building upon his categorization, I argue that algorithmic power can be further developed into a triangulated formation, intersected by the perspectives of infrastructure power, data power, and circulation power that are perpetuated by socio-cultural, geopolitical, and economic impetuses. Infrastructure is a physical manifestation of the internet, and data centers are where the cloud touches the ground. Jennifer Holt and Patrick Verdereau address the foreseeable disparity of data production and the capacity of data storage, noting the invisibility of the media infrastructure and the large energy consumption it takes to maintain and use services. A cloud power that would have the fifth largest demand of electricity in the world if it were a country. Nicole Starosisky's fixed flow further conceives media infrastructure of underwater cables as resources for media and vice versa. This phenomenon allows for the growth of a twisted economic geography where manipulation from the cable providers can benefit from the client's usage, which is similar to governments and officials who are able to use cables as a leverage that in turn results in a higher demand for cables. But infrastructure power is only a fundamental aspect that sustains algorithmic power. What's pressing is the power of data extraction and manipulation. Hito Starr in her article A Sea of Data coins the term data neolithic, which inventively frames this post-digital era inundated by AI's pattern recognition and machine learning. Connecting to apophenia, Starr discusses the ontological need to distinguish between signal and noise, citing AI's inceptionism through neural networks and Google's deep dreaming, which demonstrates a version of corporate animism in which commodities are not only fetishes but morph into franchised chimeras. Data power, in that sense, is transformed into an invisible face with multiple eyes that constantly surveys and monitors us, selling and rearranging our information to the third parties. Third is a circulation power. Similar to the previous two types of power, it creates a similar feedback loop where media industry will exert powers on creator audiences and the media environment in general and the political economy of media and culture. According to David Hesmontel and Amanda Delot, this type of power encompasses three subcategories: interface placement, recommendation search and other functions, and metric display power. While the two authors refrain from using the word bias to describe inadequate results of the recommendation search algorithms, one should be aware of the salient role that algorithms play in facilitating circulation power driven by the political economy of media. With these types of power represented, we could start to ponder on corresponding tactics to subvert control in the algorithmic world. Wendy Trinh writes that we're living in a virtually gated community based on homophily instead of heterophily, thus encouraging us to establish networks that based on mutual indifferences for a more sustainable future. Under the light, my next section visualizes a post-digital world, reflecting on the algorithmic bias that concentrate on similarities rather than differences. It is a statement about the toxicity of algorithmic bias, apophenia, surveillance, infrastructure power, panopticon policing, and forms of privileges combined. An apocalyptic and segregated landscape that questions the ambiguous future of AI and algorithms. Algorithmic bias is partially due to the lack of efficiency in decoding thick descriptions and their embedded ironies established by the programmers. However, it is a much more complex system that involves with a multitude of unknown factors, which is to be discovered in the field of the empirical. Just as Nick Silver once deduces, algorithmic systems are not necessarily populated by data fundamentalists, but rather by diverse and ambivalent characters working in context and with meanings that cannot be simply read or guessed at, but which must be found empirically. In that regard, ethnography is a practical method to redress algorithmic bias, as it facilitates to see algorithms not in but as culture, parallel to the concept of positioning race as technology. In the text, Silver offers 5 practical ethnographic tactics to render a traceable path of algorithmic operations. Among them is the idea of scavenge as a response towards secrecy. Silver recounts his personal experience in collecting off-the-record chats with engineers attempting to collect information wherever possible in a corporation, thus transforming the study of specified configurations into a study of algorithmic culture. Combining this approach to the practices of SEL films, I propose social scientists to scavenge information with big data companies by applying the sensory ethnographic aesthetics, producing ethnographic film that exposes secrecy of AI and machine learning. In terms of facial recognition algorithm, masking sounds like a promising tactic. Shaka McLaughlin proposes the application of masks to create opacity for the individuals and in the meantime demanding transparency from the government. His concept of mask as a form of black data ushers a new practical lens to respond to big data tactically. He cites Zach Bluth's facial weaponization suite that applies 4 types of amorphous 3D rendered masks that the biometric facial recognition fails to detect, thus successfully refuse hegemonic forms of political representation. Toward the future of algorithms, let us consider the ongoing dilemma of whether or not to proceed with improving AI, bearing in mind a point of no return where machines will be able to reproduce themselves without the aid from humans, thus an intelligence of explosion. Trevor Paglen's invisible image also sheds light on the need to theorize tactics to redress algorithmic bias. As Paglen notes, the relationship between images and powers in the machine-machine landscape is different than the human visual landscape. So to truly hide from machine vision systems, we should not only develop tactics to thwart algorithms of today, but also from the future. What's more, I propose to look at the concept of grace as a possible solution to redress the algorithmic bias. A term stands for propriety and the concept of tolerance toward the algorithmic discrimination. Algorithmic biases demand time for correction, and mistakes seems unavoidable due to its large size of information processing. The more the algorithms train and correct, the more impactful they will become to our day-to-day lives. Once we have discovered the remedy to a bias and on the process of correcting it, the system of grace may come in handy to cover the wound the algorithmic bias has triggered. Thus, instead of turning algorithmic bias into what Cathy O'Neil has coined weapons of math destruction, in theory, a system of grace will provide a more lenient reaction toward algorithmic bias. At the same time, let us recall Simone Brown in her Black Matter that exposes a questionable model of panopticon and cites Bion's suggestion to place panopticon, panoptical, panopticism under erasure. Perhaps one can also look at algorithmic bias in the same manner, recognizing its presence, but at the same time denying its validity as description might be the most honest resolution. Thus, just like racism is constructive in the eyes of Ruha Benjamin, algorithmic bias could also be read the same way. After understanding the forms of power to contributing to the ongoing phenomenon of algorithmic bias and the available and emergent tactics to redress such biases, to conclude the chapter, we should invest a massive network to connect professionals from different fields, raising new tactics to redress algorithmic bias that resonates with Noble's call to action before blunt artificial intelligence decision-making trumps nuanced human decision-making.